I now yield. We're prepared to close.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Ohio.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, you said defunding the police is not a slogan, it is a policy demand. Over 20 cities in this great country enacted that. They did that to the tune of $1.7 billion taken from the brave men and women who protect us all. That is our concern. We'd have loved to work with the other side. We had a bill. Senator Scott worked tirelessly on it. Representative Stauber, former police officer Stauber, on our side, worked night and day on it. But Democrats wouldn't work with us, wouldn't take any of our amendments. This is partisan, political bill. Unfortunately, that's why I urge a no vote. With that, we yield back our time.
Gentleman yields. Gentleman from New York is recognized.
I now yield the balance of our time to the gentlelady from California, Ms. Waters.
Gentlelady from New York, California is recognized. From California is recognized for 1 minute.
Madam Speaker, I rise in support of the George Floyd Justice in Policing Act, which bans police chokeholds, creates a national police misconduct registry, and eliminates qualified immunity among needed provisions. I grieved when first watching George Floyd's murder by a cop, and I grieve still over the continued loss of so many blacks killed by cops. There have been 149 black men killed at the hands of police since George Floyd's murder. I've been fighting against this police brutality since my first days as a member of the California State Assembly. But here we are, mourning the victims of police chokeholds, blacks being shot in the backs, fathers being killed in front of their children and their families. We blacks are under siege by rogue cops that we pay to protect and serve us, and white supremacists and domestic terrorists. And so we've got to resist this. We've got to say to bad cops in blue that we're going to fight you, or Proud Boys in yellow gear. We're going to fight you. We're going to resist you. I yield back to balance of my time.
All time for debate has expired. Pursuant to House Resolution 179, the previous question is ordered on the bill. The question is on engrossment and third reading of the bill. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. The ayes have it. Third reading.
The bill. Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, there is a crisis at the border. I mean, the president even said so. There is chaos at the border. The crisis and the chaos have been created by policies of this administration. We were down at the border 2 weeks ago. Every agent we talked to, every single Border Patrol agent we talked to said the crisis has been created by policy changes made by the Biden administration, specifically 3. They announced to the world they weren't going to deport anyone, moratorium on deportation. They announced to the world they weren't going to finish the wall, and most importantly, they got rid of the Remain in Mexico policy. And what do we have? We had March, the highest number of illegal immigrants coming into our nation since they've been keeping records. So it is definitely a crisis, definitely chaos. And what do the Democrats do? What do the Democrats do? Last month, they passed 2 bills that give amnesty to millions of illegal immigrants. You can't make this stuff up. And then today they're going to pass a piece of legislation that takes power away from the commander-in-chief, takes power away from the individual who was on the ballot and was elected, and gives it to the unelected Secretary of State and Secretary of Homeland Security. I mean, you would think if they were going to take power away from the president, they would at least give it to the vice president. After all, she's the one who's been put in charge of this thing. But they don't even do that. They don't even do that. The answer is real simple. What we should be focused on, reinstating the policies that worked. In fact, Again, when we were down there 2 weeks ago, and by the way, we invited the Democrats to go with us, they said no. When we were down there 2 weeks ago, every Border Patrol agent said reinstate the policies that were working and we don't have the problem. We don't have the crisis. But no, we couldn't do something that common sense. We couldn't do something that simple, that basic. They instead come with this legislation. Reinstate the policies that work. Don't take power away from the individual who was elected by the American people, the commander-in-chief. Don't implement crazy policies. Do the things that work. But no, that's not what we're going to do. And then after this bill's done, they're going to say, oh, by the way, bring in the lawyers. Give access to counsel to people coming into our country. It makes absolutely no sense. One of the speakers earlier said, out of many, one. That is so true about this country. But is it too much to ask to have the many who come into this country do it legally and have policies in place that make sense? Is that too much to ask? I think most taxpayers, most Americans think that makes good common sense. This bill does not. I hope we vote it down. I hope we go back to the policies that work. With that, Madam Speaker, we yield back the balance of our time.
On a fundamental question. Why don't Democrats on this committee want to know how the virus started? 17 months, 150 million cases worldwide, 600,000 Americans lost their lives. Where did this thing start? Did it jump from an animal to humans, or was it a leak from a lab in Wuhan, China? American people probably like to know. After all, they've had their liberties assaulted for the past year. The World Health Organization did a study and issued a report. The same World Health Organization that Republicans on this committee asked to come in front of this committee 3 separate times, and the Democrats denied us our request. Their report said this, quote, it was extremely unlikely that the lab leak was the cause. Just one problem with that finding. Nobody believes them. President Biden's Director of National Intelligence, Avril Haines, said this, that's not our assessment. Secretary of State Blinken said, we've got real concerns about the methodology and process that went into the WHO report. Secretary of Health and Human Services, Becerra, former colleague of ours, said, quote, we have to understand how COVID surfaced, but the Select Committee in Congress on COVID doesn't want to know. Journalists want to know. Josh Rogan, Washington Post column 2 weeks ago, he starts his column off by quoting our colleague, Congressman Gallagher. Understanding the cause of the pandemic and ensuring that something like it never happens again is the most important question we face. He goes on to say this, the Republicans are taking the first steps in a long overdue effort, but without backing from Democrats, who are conspicuously absent from these efforts, the investigations will struggle. Very true. The Select Committee on the coronavirus won't look into how coronavirus started. I find that fascinating. I find that amazing. Nicholas Wade, former New York Times science writer, said this when looking at the 2 scenarios. He says, quote, it's a stretch to get the pandemic to break out naturally outside of Wuhan and then without leaving a trace to make its first appearance in Wuhan. But he says this, for the lab escape scenario, a Wuhan origin for the virus is a no-brainer. Wuhan is home to China's leading center for coronavirus research. Researchers were genetically engineering bat coronaviruses to attack human cells. They were doing so under minimal safety conditions. If the virus with an uninspected infectiousness had been generated there, its escape would be no surprise. Journalists want to know. Secretary of State wants to know. Secretary of Health and Human Services want to know, journalists want to know, Republicans want to know, Americans want to know. Why don't Democrats in Congress want to know where this thing started? Is it because Speaker Pelosi called it a diversion last year when we were raising these questions and asking to have these witnesses brought in front of us? Or maybe it's because Dr. Fauci, the all-knowing Dr. Fauci, who Mr. Rogan in his piece said has, quote, repeatedly thrown cold water on the lab leak theory, maybe Dr. Fauci would have to answer some tough questions if we actually dug into how this thing started. Remember, Dr. Fauci gave EcoHealth $3 million. EcoHealth then gave $600,000 to the Wuhan lab. Did Dr. Fauci know about this arrangement when he okayed the grant? Did Dr. Fauci know the Wuhan lab did not operate with the highest level of safety standards as reported by our own State Department personnel in China? How about the process? There's a review board at HHS for any grants that do, quote, gain-of-function research. Now, 2 weeks ago, Dr. Fauci told Senator Paul that The grant to Wuhan lab was not, quote, gain-of-function research. But several respected doctors disagree, say it was. How does this review board process work? Who sits on the board? The truth is, nobody knows. The only thing we know about this board is its chairman, and we only know that because he disclosed it in January 2020. Report here. Chris Hassel, the chairman, disclosed his involvement January 2020 in a talk before the National Science Advisory Board for Biosecurity. He said during the talk that the current definition of what comes in front of his board is, quote, very narrow. Quote, I'll just probably be more frank than may be appropriate. I think it's too narrow. He then went on and suggested that the government could be funding gain-of-function research that his committee hasn't vetted. There's some important questions there for Dr. Fauci. How about the fundamental question? The fundamental question. Why are we funding research in a lab in Wuhan, China in the first place? Why are we doing that? I think the American people like to know, especially what they've went through over the last year. And just as important, Mr. Chairman, why won't this committee, the only committee in the United States Congress focused solely on the coronavirus, why won't we look into how this thing started? I think the American people like an answer to that question. I yield.
It always seems that the leaks from our institutions and government agencies benefit Democrats. I mean, we just had as Mr. Bishop pointed out, we just have the fact that the IRS leaked the personal tax returns of U.S. citizens. Just happened to be at the time that Democrats are trying to raise taxes on the American people. And then, of course, there's what happened, someone from the FBI or DOJ leaking information about the fact that Mr. DeJoy, at least it's been reported that Mr. DeJoy is under investigation for, if you can believe what's written in the press, for alleged campaign finance violations that took place between 2004, I think, and 2015. So even if he did it, it seems to me the statute of limitations has run. So I want to ask about that in particular. Is there an internal investigation at the Justice Department, or more specifically at the FBI? I know you have an inspections division. This is the division, my understanding, that looked into Andy McCabe's issue when he leaked information that he shouldn't have leaked. Is there some kind of internal investigation going on?
Well, as you by now have probably come to expect from me, Congressman, of course I can't confirm any specific investigations, but what I can tell you...
I'm not talking about an investigation that the FBI is, I'm talking about an internal investigation to actions that someone in your division may have leaked information to the press regarding the Postmaster General.
Likewise, I wouldn't confirm a specific investigation. We have our inspection division has a unit dedicated to internal investigations, and we put some of our best people in it because of how important it is. We also have, that I stood up in the last administration, in our counterintelligence division, a dedicated leak unit to pursue criminal investigations where that is appropriate. In some cases, they work with each other, you know, because there's an administrative side and a criminal side. But really, that's all I can say. I can't really confirm specific investigations.
I understand. You've given that answer to us. And look, I get that. You've given that answer to us 1,000 times a day and 1,000 times and the other times you testified. I understand that. But when we're talking about the Postmaster General of the United States, we're talking about the tax returns of the American citizens. Again, all conveniently timed, it seems to me. I mean, last summer, many Democrats called for the Postmaster General to step down. The left had all kinds of protesters at his house last summer in the whole debate about mail-in voting. And then we see this story sort of out of nowhere that supposedly he's under investigation. I just was curious if you'd tell us if it's internal. Does the FBI give critical race theory training to your agents and employees?
Not to my knowledge. We certainly provide different kinds of diversity training, just like almost any organization these days, but certainly I've never heard of any kind of critical race theory training.
But is that a yes or a no? Is there critical race theory training going on at the FBI, yes or no?
And my answer is not that I'm aware of.
Not that you're aware of, okay. How about this, the issue of this, the Washington Post reported back in April that FBI had sent, quote, geofence search warrants to Google and got information about January 6th phone numbers of folks here on Capitol Hill. And that include members and staff and others who were authorized to be in the Capitol on that date. How did you distinguish? It's our understanding, according to the news reports, there's an exclusion list of folks who were, supposed to be in the Capitol that day.
How is that all being handled? How did you determine who's on the exclusion list, who isn't? How did you get that information, and what are you doing with that information now, particularly the phone numbers and identifying phones of members of Congress and staff who are supposed to be on Capitol Hill?
So I think you anticipated probably the most important part in your question, which is, again, and I want to be careful not to talk about any specific investigation, but the geolocation data that we're talking about is, again, it doesn't identify a person, it identifies a device. And so one of the first things we needed to do, because on January 6th itself, our focus was on trying to secure you all and the facility, so we weren't arresting people here on site. So after the fact, we needed to figure out who was here by looking at the list of device numbers. And then with that, we needed to be able to get from, and I think we got it from the Capitol Police, but I'm not sure about that, a list of who was, as you said, supposed to be here so that we could exclude those people and focus on the numbers of
We know that
who were
some
not
people-
supposed to be here.
No,
and then using those numbers, then start to pursue logical investigative leads of the people who were not supposed to be.
No, I appreciate that, and thank you. But some people who were supposed to be here, we know were subsequently called by the FBI, and they were staff on Capitol Hill. That's because you didn't know, you were finding out. I mean, what was going on there?
The gentlelady's time has expired. The witness may answer the question.
Well, again, I don't want to speak to any specific investigation, but our reasons for going to interview witnesses about things are a lot more than geolocation data. So it may have been that we saw a video footage of somebody and we think this person saw something in this place, or some witness told us go talk to this person because they know what happened over here. So there's a whole host of reasons why we would have gone to interview somebody that might have nothing to do with geolocation data. So I can't really speak to any specific person who was.
The exclusion list
Gentlelady's time
totally
is, the gentlelady's time is
Friday,
expired.
January 31st, 2020 at 10:32 p.m., Dr. Fauci gets an email from Christian Anderson. Christian Anderson's a British researcher who's received numerous grants from NIH. Two really important sentences are in that email. Two sentences that get Dr. Fauci's attention. The first is this: the unusual features of the virus make up a really small part of the genome. So one has to look really closely at all the sequences to see that some of the features look engineered. Again, this is January 31st, 2020. Second sentence: Eddie, Bob, Mike, and myself all find the genome inconsistent with expectations from evolutionary theory. Email arrives 10:32 to Dr. Fauci on January 31st, 2020. 2 hours later at 12:29 in the morning, Dr. Fauci sends an email to his top deputy, Mr. Hugh Auchincloss. Guys, worked for Fauci for 15 years, part of his inner circle. Sends it, subject line says important in all capital letters. He attaches a paper on gain-of-function research written by Dr. Barrick and Dr. Shi. Dr. Shi, of course, is the so-called Bat Lady, Batwoman, the lady who does research in the Wuhan, China lab. This email, Dr. Fauci says, again, to his top deputy, it is essential that we speak this AM. Keep your cell phone on, read this paper. You will have tasks to do today that must be done. Notice the intensity. Notice the focus. I mean, this is the house is on fire email here. Now, 2 hours after that, at 2:48 in the morning, Dr. Fauci's busy this morning. 12:29, that email he sent to Dr. Auchincloss, his top deputy. 2 hours later at 2:48 in the morning, he sends another email, this one to Robert Kadlec, Assistant HHS Secretary, Trump appointee, not part of his inner circle, and he attaches a different article to this email, one that says the virus came from an animal, that downplays any lab leak theory. Now, again, notice the tone of this one. Bob, this just came out today. Gives a balanced view, best, Tony. I mean, totally different from the previous. This is one like, oh, if you get a chance, read this, gives a balanced view. So the tone is different, but also that sentence, gives a balanced view, it's not true either. That's just not accurate. This article downplays, as I said, the lab leak theory, emphasizes evolutionary cause to the virus. What happens next? What happens next? Later that same morning at 11:47 a.m., Dr. Fauci's deputy gets back to him. I just want to read you this whole email. The paper you sent me, the one he sent him on, that was written by the virologist from Wuhan, China, and Dr. Barrick, the paper you sent me says the experiments were performed before the gain-of-function pause, but have since been reviewed and approved by NIH. Not sure what that means, since Emily, someone else who works for Dr. Fauci, is sure that no coronavirus work has gone through the P3 framework, which of course is the oversight body that's supposed to approve any grant dollars going for gain-of-function research. No coronavirus work has gone through the P3 framework. Final sentence, she will try to determine if we have any distant ties to this work abroad. She will try to determine if our fingerprints are on any of this. All these emails happen in 13 hours. So 13 hours after Dr. Fauci gets the initial email from Christian Anderson saying, looks like this virus is engineered, not consistent with evolutionary theory, Dr. Fauci knows some important facts. First, Dr. Fauci knows there's a lethal virus on the loose that started in Wuhan, China. Second, he knows the American taxpayers have funded gain-of-function research in Wuhan, China. Third, he knows that the research grant didn't go through the required oversight board. Fourth, he knows the virus, quote, looks engineered and, quote, not consistent with evolutionary theory. And finally, fifth, Dr. Fauci knows he may have ties to this work in China. His fingerprints, in fact, may be on this. So what does Dr. Fauci do next? After he says, oh, whatever, what does he do next? He organizes a conference call for later that same day. I mean, this is the busiest 24 hours I think I've ever. He organizes a conference call, 12 people on the call. Dr. Fauci and 11 virologists from around the world. Virologists who've gotten millions of American tax dollars over the past several years. Now look at this list. Here's the list of people. There's only 2 Americans on the list, Tony Fauci and one other. Most of them are from around the world, as I said. I think the first thing you notice is who's not on the call. Who's not on the list? Is Dr. Kadlik on the list? The guy he sent the email to at 3 in the morning? Is Dr. Redfield the head of CDC? Dr. Girard, who's with us today, Assistant Secretary at HHS at the time? Dr. Birx, the lady who's soon to be COVID response coordinator? In fact, there's no one from the government on the call except Tony Fauci. Tony Fauci and 11 other individuals who got a bunch of American tax dollars over the years. What happened on the conference call? The short answer is we don't know. We don't know what they talked about. I mean, I think we got a good idea. We don't know for sure, but we do know what happened 4 days later. 4 days later, February 4th, 2020, Christian Anderson, the guy who started it all, who said the virus looks engineered, Christian Anderson said this 4 days later. The crackpot theories going around at the moment relate to this virus being somehow engineered. That is demonstrably false, close quote. What? In 4 days, this guy went from this looks engineered to now that's demonstrably false. 4 days, he went from this isn't consistent with evolutionary theory. Now we know it's totally evolutionary. But it gets even better. It gets even better. Mr. Anderson and 3 of the other people on this call write an article a few weeks later that says COVID is not a laboratory construct. And while they're writing that article, there's an email from March 6 where Mr. Anderson offers to let Dr. Fauci edit the article before it's published. And here's the kicker. Here's the kicker. When the article is published, Dr. Fauci cites it at a White House press conference when he is asked by a reporter about the origin of the virus. Cites the very article he put in motion on the conference call and he was allowed to edit. At the White House, where he's supposed to be giving the American people the truth, he references an article that he manufactured. Now, maybe I'm wrong about all this. Maybe it didn't work out this way. I think I'm right. Maybe it didn't work out this way. But it would have been nice, Mr. Chairman, if Dr. Fauci would come today and answer our questions. He could have come here and defended himself, but he didn't have the courage to do it. And you know who else wouldn't come? Remember that email about the P3 framework? We invited Dr. Hassel to come too. He's the individual who chairs that oversight board. We invited him to come today too, and he wouldn't come. I'm convinced these guys knew right from the get-go what the truth was, and they misled the American people. Oh, here's the other thing. You know that conference call? That conference call? We got the emails regarding the conference call from February 2nd. All these guys were emailing back and forth. They were on that conference call. Here's what we got on the FOIA request. Here's all their emails. Every single thing is redacted. Every single thing is redacted about what took place in that conference call, because I'm convinced it was at that conference call where they said, we got to cover our tracks. And again, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm wrong. But Dr. Fauci could have been sitting right there and answering our questions, and he wouldn't come today. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Jordan, and let the record reflect that Dr. Fauci was invited Friday afternoon. He declined.
Thank you, Jim. The leader and Jim are exactly right. This has always been about politics, and today's actions of the speaker just confirm that. But frankly, and I've said this before, what else are they going to talk about? I mean, they're so focused on the January 6th committee. What else are they going to talk? Are they going to talk about crime? The fact that crime is up in every major urban area in this country. They're going to talk about the border crisis. I mean, think about this. March was the highest month on record for illegal crossings until April. April was the highest month on record until May. May was the highest month on record until June. Can't talk about that. They're going to talk about inflation. They're going to talk about the fact that the price of eggs is up, the price of milk is up, the price of bread is up, the price of gas is up, the price of an airline ticket is up, the price of the price of everything is up. They can't talk about that. So they're going to be partisan, and they're going to focus on this. But as the leader said, and as Mr. Banks said, I don't think they're going to address the fundamental question. The fundamental question of why wasn't there a proper security presence at the Capitol that day? They're not going to address that. And only one person can answer that question. Only one. Speaker of the United States House of Representatives. My hunch is the reason they don't want to address that question, my hunch is because what happened all last year? The Democrats normalized anarchy. They normalized rioting and looting. And when rioters and looters attacked our law enforcement personnel, when rioters and looters destroyed small businesses, what did Democrats do? They went out and raised money to bail them out of jail, and they continue to talk about defunding the police, and in fact did that in all these major urban areas, which is why crime is up. So they don't want to talk about that stuff. They just want to be partisan. They just want to continue to attack the former president. They want to play their political game. So I applaud Leader McCarthy for saying we're going to do our job. We're going to continue to work and get to the bottom and answer the questions that the leader raised, the questions that, frankly, the American people want answers to.
Thank you very much, Mr. Jordan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and to you and Ranking Member and the members of the Rules Committee. H.R. 4 is just another attempt to exert federal control over states and localities. It's a partisan power grab. In 1965, Congress passed the Voting Rights Act to overcome pervasive state resistance and barriers that prevented minorities from exercising their right to vote. In 2013, the Supreme Court in Shelby County versus Holder held that continuing to require states to, quote, pre-clear election law changes based upon conduct from decades ago was an unconstitutional invasion of state sovereignty. The court recognized that, quote, the conditions that originally justified these measures no longer characterize voting in the covered jurisdictions. And that's a good thing. It means we've made progress. I mean, we should frankly be celebrating the amazing changes from what was happening, the wrong things that were happening in the 60s compared to where we are today with our voting laws. The court also found that if Congress drafts a new coverage formula, quote, exceptional conditions must exist to justify the extraordinary departure from the traditional course of relations between the states and the federal government. Thankfully, America of 2021 is not America of 1965. As I said, despite what Democrats want everyone to believe, these exceptional conditions do not exist. There is no recent record of rampant voter suppression or discrimination. In fact, minority participation in elections today is exceptionally better than it was in 1965. And during the 2020 election, voter turnout was higher across all racial groups. In fact, from the Shelby County decision, Chief Justice Roberts said, black voter registration before the VRA in Mississippi was 6.4%. Today, or actually in 2004, I'm sure it's higher today, 2004, 76.1%, higher than among white voters in the state of Mississippi. That's what you call progress. That's a good thing. We should celebrate that. Regardless of the data and the Supreme Court precedent, the Democrats still insist that a pre-clearance regime is necessary. The latest version of H.R. 4 is a federal takeover of elections contrary to the Constitution's clear intention. H.R. 4 includes a new coverage formula that would allow federal court to retain jurisdiction over state or political subdivision for 10 years if as few as 3 voting rights violations had occurred over the last 25. But H.R. 4 also takes a novel approach to determining and defining what's a violation, where a state or political subdivision can rack up voting, quote, voting rights violations without any final court judgment of discrimination. Someone just brings a claim
There might be some kind of settlement because the state or the local jury that doesn't want to spend taxpayer dollars, whatever, and go through a court decision, and that's going to be tallied up as a violation. Instead of settlement agreements and consent decrees in addition to court orders and objections by the Attorney General will suffice to trigger a violation designation. Let's be honest, the real aim of this provision is to utilize the pre-clearance process to allow the Democrats' political allies at the Department of Justice and other left-wing organizations to control state election rules in violations of the principles of federalism. H.R. 4's practice-based coverage provision doubles down on the unconstitutional pre-clearance formula. This provision is designed to target popular voter integrity measures by requiring every state and political subdivision to pre-clear certain election practices, including changes to voter identification requirements and changes to voter registration list maintenance processes with the Department of Justice. A recent poll found 81% of Americans support voter identification laws, but Democrats still want the Department of Justice to weigh in on this. Additionally, this bill creates a new extraordinary legal standard for courts to grant injunctive relief if the Voting Rights Act related actions and impose burdensome reporting requirements on states and localities. H.R. 4, as introduced in the 117th Congress, includes a rewrite of Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act in response to the Supreme Court's July 2021 decision in Brnovich versus the Democrat National Committee. Justice Alito, writing for the court, found that, quote, equal openness of election procedures remains the touchstone in establishing whether there is a violation of Section 2, and he set out a non-exhaustive list of factors for courts to examine during its totality of the circumstances review. The Democrats didn't hide the ball with this one. They specifically wrote in H.R. 4 that courts may not consider any of the factors Justice Alito laid out in his opinion. To justify the unconstitutional federal reach of H.R. 4, Democrats have argued that states have enacted allegedly suppressive voting laws. This is not the case. Simply not true. It's easier today for eligible Americans to vote than ever before in our nation's history. Voting remains a fundamental, constitutionally protected right in this country, and Republicans want every eligible citizen to vote and every legal ballot to count. But Democrats and their allies in this administration want to politicize the enforcement of the Voting Rights Act. Look no further than the recent actions from the Justice Department. In 2020, we all know about this because it happened in several of our states. In 2020, state and local governments were tasked with administering elections in a safe manner during a once-in-a-lifetime virus. Many states adopted temporary voting procedures to reduce public health concerns, sometimes in a manner that I clearly believe violated Article 2 of the Constitution, despite prominent public health officials saying that in-person voting was safe. But this administration is now telling states that if they want to return to the election procedures they had just 18 months ago, in some cases just a year ago, they could face litigation from the Justice Department. And this same Justice Department, the Biden Justice Department, is refusing to say whether it would review the process by which some states adopted the measures in the first place. So it can only ratchet one way here, according to the Biden Justice Department. And now we see the Biden Justice Department suing states that are trying to improve election administration by implementing voting integrity measures. What's telling, however, is that the Biden Justice Department is targeting only Republican-led states and ignoring Democrat-led states. Imagine that. Such as President Biden's home state of Delaware that has more restrictive election administration laws than several of the states that have been in the news and have been targeted by this Justice Department. These changes in Republican-led states seek to not only enhance election integrity, but also increase the public's confidence in the election process. This is exactly how our country's voting system was set up to work. States and localities analyze what worked for them during the past election and then make changes accordingly. They do not need bureaucrats in Washington telling them how they should run their election. North Carolina's Lieutenant Governor Mark Robinson said it best when he testified before the Judiciary Committee. As the chairman indicated, we've had a number of hearings. Mr. Robinson said this: "We need to stop this. The insinuation that somehow the people in Washington, D.C. know better than the people in North Carolina. You do not, and we will not tolerate it." End of his quote. We need to put an end to these partisan federal power grabs. States are the entities best situated to administer elections within their jurisdiction. I urge the committee to adopt an open rule on this legislation so Republicans can amend it to reflect the realities on the ground. And I think the gentleman, he's right on target. And I would just say, you know who else agrees with you and your constituents? At least he used to. Joe Biden.
Right.
December 2020, I don't think vaccines should be mandatory. I wouldn't demand it be mandatory. So deep down, even the President of the United States knows this isn't going to fly constitutional. There's no way this is going to fly. But he's engaged in doing exactly what the gentleman from Louisiana described, trying to change the narrative. He knows deep down. Dr. Fauci said the same thing. The all-knowing Reverend Fauci said the same thing. He doesn't think vaccines should be mandatory. Suddenly he changes his position. So I think everyone knows this is unconstitutional. And this committee, as the gentleman pointed out, should stand up and say, we're not going to tolerate this kind of, this is a good amendment. I hope we adopt it. I yield back.
Mr. Jordan, let me come to you. You're a lawyer too, right?
Nope.
Okay, I thought you got in law school.
I went to law school, never took the bar exam.
Oh, gotcha, okay. Gotcha. My dad never took the bar either, so. Do you oppose the use of criminal contempt charges against people who refuse to testify before Congress?
No, we've used it. I mean, we contempt Lois Lerner after a year of hearings and investigation.
You sure did, didn't you? You said the U.S. attorney had a legal duty to go to the grand jury, didn't you?
Well, it says shall. When the Congress voted for contempt, it says shall go to the grand jury. That U.S. attorney did it.
That's right. And you also said the U.S. attorney unilaterally decided to ignore the will of the House of Representatives.
It's true.
You said Mr. Manchin was legally bound to convene a grand jury, but indeed he ignored his obligation and unilaterally decided to ignore the will of the House of Representatives. Don't you think it's important that when we're exercising our Article I powers to get the evidence we need in order to legislate, that people obey the subpoenas of the United States House of Representatives? You used to believe that, Mr. Jordan. Do you no longer believe that?
Once a legitimate investigation, sure.
All right.
Sure.
In 2012, the Oversight Committee approved a resolution holding Attorney General Holder in contempt of Congress. Do you remember that one?
Say it again. I was thinking how I was going to elaborate on the answer when you cut me off to ask me the question again,
Well,
please.
continue, Mr. Jordan, because everybody's always violating your rights, so I'm going to give you all the time you want.
No one's violating my rights.
Okay. Well, look, let me remind you what you said when Attorney General Holder was held in criminal contempt of Congress. We simply want the facts, because Attorney General Eric Holder will not provide what the law requires. We are left with no other option except to hold him in contempt. We're doing the exact same thing, Mr. Jordan.
No, we're
with
not.
all the bluster about the border and all the other nonsense you're talking about, Russia and everything. We are holding him in contempt for violating a subpoena of the United States House of Representatives.
There wasn't some special select committee that Republicans were not permitted to serve on that issued those subpoenas. That's not the case.
All right, well, let's
This
close
came
with
from the
this.
Oversight
Mr.
Committee
Jordan, why
and the
did you vote
Judiciary
against the commission of 5 Republicans, 5 Democrats equals subpoena power? Why did you oppose that? Are you also not interested in what happened to us on January 6th?
Of course, everyone is interested in holding people accountable who did wrong. The FBI is doing that. The Justice Department is doing that appropriately so. What I'm not interested in
So why did you have all
is
those
a
Benghazi investigations if you don't
motivated
think Congress should be investigating?
Because Hillary Clinton misled the American people.
Mr. Chairman, I yield back to you. I yield back to you, Mr. Chairman.
If you want to... Thank you, Madam Speaker. I thank the gentleman for yielding. Look, we've seen the worst 10 months of any administration in history. We went from a secure border to chaos. We went from safe streets to violent crime. We've seen stable prices turn into inflation and empty shelves. The respect around the world we had is now turned into the debacle that was the exit from Afghanistan. And we went from peace in the Middle East with the Abraham Accords to thousands of rockets being fired on our friend and ally Israel, not to mention energy independence, to now the spectacle of the President of the United States begging OPEC to increase production. But what scares me most is what this administration and Democrats are doing to freedom. Every right we enjoy under the First Amendment has been assaulted over the last year. Your right to practice your faith, still places today in the country where a full congregation can't meet on Sunday morning. Your right to petition your government, your right to assemble, freedom of the press, freedom of speech, every single one's been attacked. We just learned in the Judiciary Committee from the Attorney General. Attorney General, National School Boards Association on last month, September 29th, sends a letter to the President of the United States asking the FBI to get involved in local school board matters. 5 days later, the Attorney General issues a memo to do just that. First sentence of the memo says this. This is the Attorney General's memo. In recent months, there's been a disturbing spike in harassment, intimidation, threats at school board meetings. We ask him a simple question. What's the evidence for that spike in threats? What's the data? What did you review? Guess what his answer was? His only evidence, the only thing he reviewed, was the letter from the School Boards Association, from a political organization. And now they're going to target parents at school board meetings, and we have the January 6th committee issuing subpoena after subpoena, 11 of the people they've issued subpoenas to.
were names on an application asking the government for permission to hold the rally. Independent individuals exercising their First Amendment right to assemble asked the government for permission. The government granted them permission, and now these 20 and 30-year-olds whose name are on that application, they're going to be deposed by these guys for simply exercising their first. Here's what they're asking them. Here's what they ask them. We want to know who the selection of speakers, who the speakers were and how were they selected. We want to know any communications these people who put their names on a permit, got permission from the government. We want to know any member of Congress you talked to. Wow. Your right to petition your government? That's what they want to subpoena. That's why they're subpoenaing these people? This is scary where they want to go. I mean, these questions, coordination of speakers, discussions of contents, this sounds like what the IRS did to people 10 years ago when they were asking 501c groups applying for tax-exempt status. Do you pray at the start of your meeting? I mean, first it's school boards, then it's people applying for a permit. We saw what they did to people, what the IRS did to people just a few years ago. Not to mention what else the committee's doing. Preservation letters to all the carriers, all the companies. Preserve every call, every email, every text. Think about that. Every call someone made to hundreds and hundreds, supposedly, according to news reports, they've done this for. Text to your spouse, calls to your mom. Preserve it all. And this is just what we know about. This is just what's been reported. I mean, now Steve Bannon. Mr. Bannon is a target of the investigation, for the investigation, because, quote, this is from the Select Committee's own report, quote, his efforts to plan political activity. That's the standard. You're involved in political activity, they're going to investigate you. We know what this is really about. This is about getting at President Trump. Getting at President Trump. Tried to stop President Trump before he was even elected with the Russia investigation. Tried to remove President Trump from office twice. While he was in office, they tried to do that. Now they're trying to get him after the fact, after he's left. All because this guy cut taxes, reduced regulations, greatest economy in the history, greatest economy in 50 years, lowest unemployment, all because he built the wall, got us out of the Iran deal, put the embassy in Jerusalem. When President Trump was president, Americans got their Christmas presents on time, but they're coming after him. The Reuters story said this: the FBI has found no evidence that President Trump or people directly around him were involved in organizing the violence. They don't care. They don't care the FBI has no evidence. Senate report said no evidence of a coordinated plan. They don't care. They're going to drag these 11 people into subpoenas, in for depositions with subpoenas, because they're so determined to get their political image.
Mr. Chairman, March 25th, Joe Biden criticizes the Georgia election law. 3 months later, the Department of Justice challenges it. September 1st, Joe Biden criticizes the new pro-life law in Texas. 8 days later, the Department of Justice challenges it. September 29th, the political organization asked President Biden to involve the FBI in local school board issues. 5 days later, the Department of Justice does just that. Mr. Attorney General, was it just a coincidence that your memo came 5 days after the National School Boards Association letter went to the president?
So we are concerned about violence and threats of violence across the board against school officials, against
Is there any connection, Mr. Attorney General, with the school board letter and then 5 days later your memo to regarding school board issues?
Obviously, the letter, which was public and asked for assistance from the Justice Department, was brought to our attention, and it's a relevant factor in making.
Who gave you the letter?
I'm sorry?
How'd you become aware of the letter? Who gave it to you?
I read about the letter in the news. That's how I read about it.
What the White House told you to write the memo?
No one in the White House spoke to me about the memo at all, but I am sure, at least I certainly would believe that the White House communicated its concerns about the letter to the Justice Department, and that is perfectly,
that was my next question. Did you or anyone at the Justice Department discuss the memo with White House personnel or with anyone at the White House before the memo was sent?
I did not. I don't know whether anyone discussed the memo. I am sure that the communication from the National Association of School Boards was discussed between the White House and the Justice Department, and that's perfectly appropriate, just as...
Who were those individuals? Who at the White House talked with? Who at the Justice Department?
I don't know.
Did they talk to you? Did someone call you?
I think I've answered. No one from the White House spoke to me, but the White House is perfectly appropriately concerned about violence, just like they're concerned about violence in the streets, and they make requests of the Justice Department in that respect, just like they're concerned about...
Did you or anyone at the Department of Justice communicate with the American Federation of Teachers, the National Education Association, and the National School Boards Association prior to your memo?
I did not. I don't know. As to
Don't know if anyone else at the Justice Department did?
I don't know.
You know if did you or anyone at the Justice Department communicate with those organizations, AFT, NEA, National School Board Association, prior to the letter? Did you help the National School Board Association put together the letter?
Again, not. I have had no such conversations. I would be surprised if that happened, but I don't know.
Will FBI agents be attending local school board meetings?
No, FBI agents will not be attending local school boards meetings, and there's nothing in this memo to suggest that. I want to, again, try to be clear. This memo is about violence and threats of violence.
Let me just point out, the same day you did the memo, the Justice Department sent out a press release, Monday, October 4th, 2021. The press release says Justice Department addresses violent threats against school officials and teachers. Now, you said earlier to a question from one of my colleagues on the Republican side that parents aren't domestic terrorists, we're not going to treat them that way. But let me just read from the third paragraph. According to the Attorney General's memorandum, the Justice Department will launch a series of additional efforts in the coming days designed to address the rising criminal conduct directed towards school personnel. Those efforts are expected to include a creation of a task force consisting of representatives from the Department's Criminal Division, Civil Rights Division, Executive Office of U.S. Attorneys, the FBI, the Community Relations Service, Office of Justice Programs, and the National Security Division. Now, I find that interesting. You said there's no way you're going to be treating parents as domestic terrorists, but you got the National Security Division in a press release regarding your memo that day.
My memo does not mention the National Security Divisions. It's addressed to
I didn't say it did. I said the press release accompanying your memo that day from the Department of Justice, right here it is,
I'm going to be as clear
talks about
as
the
I
National
can be.
Security
This
Division
is
being
not-
part of this effort.
I want to be clear as I can be. This is not about what happens inside school board meetings. It's only about threats of violence and violence aimed at school officials, school employees, and teachers.
First sentence of your
Respect
memo,
the
very
First
first
Amendment.
sentence, you said, in recent months there's been a disturbing spike in harassment, intimidation, threats of violence.
Yes.
When did you first review the data showing this so-called disturbing uptick?
So I read the letter, and we have been seeing over time threats.
Whoa. I didn't ask you. So you read the letter, that's your source?
So let me be clear. This is not a prosecution or an
Is there some
investigation.
study, some effort, some investigation someone did that said there's been a disturbing uptick, or you just take the words of the National School Board Association?
When the National School Board Association, which represents thousands of school boards and school board members, says that there are these kind of threats, when we read in the newspapers reports of threats of violence, when that is in the context of threats of violence
The
against
source
all-
for this, for the very first line in your memo.
Time of the gentleman has
disturbing spike
expired.
Was the School
The time
Boards
of the gentleman has
Association
been
letter.
expired. Mr. Deutsch.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Crabtree, when did, excuse me, when did you lose your job?
Thank you, Congressman. About 3 hours after the presidential inauguration this year.
January 20th, 2021, you lost your job. That's right?
Yes, sir.
What has happened? Do you know what's happened to the price of gasoline since that day?
I think everybody knows the answer to that question, Congressman. It's going nowhere but up, just like we tried to warn.
It's increased dramatically, hasn't it? Over $1 a gallon.
Yes, sir.
You know what's happened to the company that was overseeing the Russian Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline? Do you know what happened to them?
I believe they were allowed to finish construction. I know that for a fact.
Yeah, the sanctions against them were waived. They were allowed to complete construction of that pipeline. At the same time, yours was closed down and you lost your job. You know what's happened to American energy independence since the day you were fired?
Well, the words OPEC seem to be coming back in the media more these days, and I didn't hear that for a lot of years, so we've lost it.
Yeah.
That's what's happened.
Mr. Summers, are CO2 emissions in the United States lower today than they were 20 years ago?
They are, Congressman.
Significantly lower, is that right?
They are significantly lower. In fact, CO2 emissions from the power sector in particular are at the lowest level since 1978.
And that's because, you know, things like cap and trade passed and regulations from the government caused you to lower them. Isn't that true?
Congressman, actually, that is because of the innovation that has occurred in the American oil and gas industry.
Exactly. Cap and trade didn't pass. It's not because of regulations from government. You guys did that on your own because it's just the right thing to do and it's good business, right?
That's right, Congressman. As I mentioned before, every energy source has to meet that energy trilemma: affordable, reliable, and cleaner. And that's what this industry has delivered.
10 months ago, was the United States of America energy independent, Mr. Summers?
What I would say, Congressman, is that the United States was North American energy independent and well on our way to American energy independence.
We were exporting a lot too, weren't we?
We were. Unfortunately, over the course of the last few months, we're actually importing oil into the United States for the first time in a while.
Yeah, that was my next question. So in 10 months' time, we went from being energy independent to now we're importing oil, and we had the spectacle of the President of the United States begging OPEC to increase production. Is that accurate?
Well, Congressman, the U.S. was a net petroleum exporter for the first time since 1958 in the year 2020. And, you know, we were very proud of being the world's largest producer of oil and natural gas as a consequence of the innovation and the technological revolution that has occurred in the American oil and gas industry.
Yeah, I mean, I can't say it better than our colleague from Florida who spoke a few minutes ago, but in 10 months' time, we have literally went from energy independence to the President of the United States begging OPEC to increase production to now we're having to import some of our energy needs. We've went from $2 gas to $3, $4, $5. I was in California a week and a half ago, $5 gas, I saw it there, which costs families hundreds of dollars a month in transportation cost. I mean, I think Mr. Crabtree, I think in his testimony said he still hasn't found a job. So not only did he lose his job because of the crazy energy policies of this government, he's now paying all kinds of more. His family's paying more for their transportation costs and other energy needs. And what do Democrats do today? They come in and badger companies, tell them to further reduce, in some cases, production of oil and gas, which is only going to exacerbate the problem. I mean, it's literally maybe the craziest thing I've ever heard, but that's where they're at. I don't think the American people are with them, though, and that's the good news. So I want to thank those companies who are actually increasing production. Mr. Summers, I want to thank you for your testimony today. Mr. Crabtree, you deserve better, and hopefully with some changes that I think are coming, because I don't think the American people are going to tolerate this. Hopefully you'll be employed real soon. And we'll get these energy prices back where the families of this great country deserve to have them. With that, I yield
back. And I now recognize for an equivalent amount of time Mr. Norman, who is the ranking member of the Subcommittee on the Environment, for an equivalent amount of time.
Thank you, Chairwoman Maloney. For my questions, I'd like to yield to Jim Jordan.
Oh, I thank the gentleman for yielding. The previous speaker used the word frustrating. I'll tell you what's frustrating is a member of Congress telling American oil and gas companies to reduce production at the same time the President of the United States is begging OPEC to increase production. That may be the dumbest thing I've ever heard, but that's the scenario we're in. God bless Chevron saying they're going to increase production. What does the gentleman want? $8 gasoline? $10 gasoline for the very families that we all represent? This is craziness what they're talking about. I yield back to the gentleman. Thank you for yielding me 30 seconds.
Thank you so much. Mr. Summers, did you realize back several months ago at an oversight hearing, I asked Ms. Greta Thunberg, who is a spokesman, for the Green New Deal and other issues the Democrats have. She has 17.9 million followers. I asked her, with China and India, how are we going to get them to cut their emissions when they're the leaders in the world and America has come down on emissions? Do you realize she said they were going to ask them to? Is this a proper response, in your opinion?
The committee will come to order. Before we begin, I want to apologize to our witnesses for the lengthy and unexpected break for votes. We appreciate your staying with us so we can continue this important hearing. Mr. Jeffries was the last, so Mr. Johnson of Louisiana.
Mr. Chairman?
What, Mr. Jordan?
Yeah. Mr. Chairman, our witness was unable to stay. And frankly, if we'd have started this committee on time, we'd have got to hear from her. She was doing an amazing job. Started 2 hours late, and then the Democrats add votes during the vote series that weren't scheduled, and now we have no witness.
Well, your staff indicated that was fine at the time.
Indicate what was fine at the time? You started the committee 2 hours late?
Yes, we had a Democratic caucus, And we informed your staff, and they indicated it was fine.
Not aware of any indication to that effect at all. All I know is our witness can't be here. She had family commitments she had to get back home for.
I'm sorry, I don't know what the, we have 3 witnesses here. I
No,
don't know what the alternative is.
The point is, when you schedule a hearing, it's not the Republicans' fault or the Republican invited witnesses' fault that you guys don't have the votes for this package that's going to harm the country. That's not our problem.
I'm not going to get into
Now we don't have a
merits-
witness.
I'm not getting into the merits of whatever we're doing other than the committee right now. We have no alternative but to continue the hearing, because when would we reconvene it?
Well, that's up to you. I don't get to schedule things.
We're going-
I wish I
we're going-
did. We'd
we're
have
going-
started if I get to schedule things, we'd have started at 10.
Yeah, well, I didn't have that choice.
Well, I mean, you're the chairman. Of
Here-
course you had that choice.
The hearing will continue. Mr. Johnson of Louisiana.
Thank the gentlelady for yielding. Madam Speaker, as we speak, the FBI is treating parents as terrorists. The Department of Justice is getting ready to pay people $450,000 who illegally entered our country, and Democrats in Congress later this week plan to spend $2 trillion more, which we all know will only exacerbate the already 30-year high inflation. And what are they doing today? Censoring a member for a cartoon. You got to be kidding me. You have got to be kidding me. The attack, what scares me most about all this is the attack that we have seen on the First Amendment over the last year from the left, from the Democrat Party. They're attacking moms for standing up and speaking at a school board meeting. They're stopping Americans. There are still places in this country where a full congregation cannot meet on a Sunday morning, stopping Americans from exercising their First Amendment freedom of religious rights. Stopping forever, the Speaker of the House stopped Americans from petitioning their member of Congress to redress their grievances, wouldn't even let them in their own capital. And now here we go again, censoring speech. The most fundamental liberty we have is our right to speak, our right to talk, our right to communicate, and they're going after that today because they don't like freedom. You can see it. They don't like it. This is wrong. We know it's wrong. What they're doing to our colleague, Mr. Gosar, is wrong, and I hope they will have second thoughts and we will vote this down. I yield back.
Thank
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Bhattacharya, where did you get your undergrad degree?
Stanford University.
Stanford?
Yes.
And you went to medical school too, and did you get your medical degree from Stanford as well?
I did, yes.
And then you also have a PhD, is that right?
Yes.
And where'd you get that?
Stanford University.
3 degrees from Stanford? And that's
4,
pretty.
actually.
That's pretty impressive. I mean, it's not the Big Ten, but it's pretty impressive. And you're now a professor at Stanford as well, right?
Yes.
And then you mentioned in your opening statement that you had some statements that you made that were part of a video put on YouTube. You had those taken down. Is that accurate?
Yes.
Why'd they take them down?
Because they didn't agree with them, I suppose.
No reason? Did they say it was not true? That it was what did YouTube tell you?
There was no reason given to me or to, and I could not discern any reason from any public statements by YouTube about why they were taken down. It was just
So supposedly some guy at YouTube or some person at YouTube decides to take them. They may have a great education. Maybe they went for Stanford for all I know. But someone at Stanford, someone at YouTube takes down your video. My guess is they probably didn't have a medical degree who did that, but they took it down.
They did. I wish I knew who took it down. I mean,
Yeah.
I would love to debate them.
I just think it's amazing. Some guy who didn't go to medical school censors the guy who did, and typically the reason given is they says it's because he wasn't following the science. And here you have a medical degree, a PhD, an undergrad degree from the university. What was in the video that they found offensive? Or again, we don't know the reason, but what was in the video? What did you say?
The main thing that was in the video that I said, I think what set them off was that I said that there are no randomized studies that show that masks work with children.
No studies that show that.
No randomized studies, no high quality studies.
I'd be interested, Dr. Kennedy. Do you think it's appropriate for YouTube to censor Dr. Bhattacharya?
I quite honestly do not have the position to be able to comment on that. My expertise does not deal with
You think it's okay for YouTube, some guy who's never went to medical school, to censor the guy who has went to medical? I mean, but this is now becoming a pattern. We just had Mr. Raskin try to lecture Dr. Bhattacharya. This happened a few weeks ago. I remember with my colleague, Dr. Green. Mr. Raskin, smart guy, but never went to medical school, and he was telling Dr. Green, giving Dr. Green medical advice on what needs to happen with patients, what needs to happen with people. I just find that, and all in the name of following the science. So I just want to know, do you think it was appropriate for YouTube to take down Dr. Bhattacharya's video?
Again, having not seen the video and not knowing who took it down or the reasons for specifically.
Dr. Eshelman, do you think it's appropriate for that kind of activity to take place, that kind of action?
Similar to Dr. Kennedy, as a scientist, I would need to review the data, and unfortunately, I can't say that I watched that video before it was taken down. Potentially, there could have been merits if there was clear, obvious, non-evidence-based or clearly contradictory information being presented. But again, I can't speak to that. I did not see it, and I don't know the inner workings of YouTube.
I just find it amazing that Dr. Bhattacharya is advocating that kids be in school, and YouTube takes that video down. Dr. Bhattacharya, is natural immunity as good as someone who's had COVID, recovered, has the antibodies? Is that natural immunity as good as someone who's had the vaccine?
Yes.
As good.
At least as good.
At least as good, maybe better. Dr. Kennedy, do you agree with that statement?
I'm not a medical doctor. I can't comment on that.
Dr. Eshelman?
I would say it's nuanced, and I would disagree with a blanket statement that it's as good or better. There already is evidence to show that, especially people who may have had a mild initial COVID infection, that their duration of antibody response does not last as long as vaccines. People who've developed more severe COVID may have as good, if not slightly better, but the data is also evolving.
Dr. Bhattacharya, should Mr. Daszak, the head of EcoHealth, should he come testify in front of this committee?
Absolutely should.
Dr. Kennedy, you think that Mr. Daszak should come testify in front of this committee?
That is outside of my purview.
Well, the Washington Post has called for it. The Wall Street Journal has called for it. Everyone I know of has called for it. The whole world wants it. The only ones that don't want to do it are Democrats on this committee. So I just want to know, as a doc, you got opinions on everything else. You think that Mr. Daszak should come testify?
I have opinions, but my expert opinion is not in that area.
Dr. Eshelman, you think Mr. Daszak should come testify?
I don't have an opinion on it because I'm focused on taking care of patients.
Do you think we need to find out how this thing started, Dr. Eshelman? You think we need to find out how this virus started? Did it start in the lab? Did it come from a bat to a pangolin to a hippopotamus to people or whatever they say? Do you think we need to figure that out?
Yes, I do think we need to figure it out, but I don't think it's the primary precedence, especially in a hearing like this. I think that optimizing care and prevention of patients is the most important.
Excuse me one second. We had a virus kill millions of people, disrupt the world economy, certainly disrupt the American economy, and you don't think it's important we find out how it started?
That's not what I said. I said that it's something that should be looked at, but I don't know that it should be the focus of this hearing.
Okay, well, I'm just asking you a question. Dr. Kennedy,
and I was answering it.
Dr. Kennedy, do you think we need to look at how this virus started? Mr. Chairman, the previous speaker got an extra minute and a half.
My non-professional opinion would be obviously yes.
All right. Dr. Bhattacharya, you think we need to figure that out? Do you think we need to figure that out?
Absolutely yes.
Final question. Dr. Bhattacharya, give me your thoughts on how Dr. Walensky, as the new CDC chair, give me your assessment of her job performance.
I think she's done a very poor job.
All right.
Can you elaborate?
The gentleman's time has expired, and he's exceeded previous speakers. Thank you for your time, Mr. Jordan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the gentleman for yielding. Americans want safer streets, affordable gas, and freedom. Instead, Democrats give us record crime levels, record inflation, and another bill attacking President Trump, sponsored by the guy who spent years misleading the Congress and, more importantly, the country on Trump-Russia investigation, on the Mueller investigation, on impeachments. Remember when the sponsor of the bill said that his office didn't meet with the whistleblower? Found out that wasn't true. Remember when the sponsor of the bill told us that we would hear from the whistleblower during impeachment? We'd actually have real process instead of having hearings and depositions in the basement, in the bunker of the Capitol. Remember when the sponsor told us this? That there was more than circumstantial evidence that President Trump colluded with Russia? That turned out to be false. Bob Mueller said it was false. Everyone knew it was false. In fact, it was such baloney, even the Washington Post has had to retract and change things from stories because they said, oh, yeah, there was a lot of false information in that dossier that they used to go spy on President Trump's campaign. And I think this is important to understand. Sponsored this legislation wasn't just any member of Congress, Mr. Speaker. He wasn't just any chairman of a committee in Congress. He was the chairman of the Intelligence Committee, the committee that gets additional information from anyone else in the country making those claims that were not accurate. So maybe instead of having another bill that attacks President Trump because Democrats are afraid he's going to run and he's going to win in 2024, so they want to do everything they can to attack him, maybe instead of another bill attacking President Trump, we should actually focus on things that the American people care about. You know, you can attack President Trump all you want. I know one thing. A year ago, the border was secure. Sure was. A year ago, cities were safe. Safer than they are today. A year ago, we didn't have a 31-year high inflation. We actually had wages going up, real wages. A year ago, we didn't have a Department of Justice attacking moms and dads, putting a label, a designation, a threat tag on parents who simply go to school board meetings and speak out against a racist hate America curriculum. No, we didn't have that a year ago. But you guys can keep attacking the president all you want, not addressing the issues that the American people care about. We're going to speak about the issues they care about. We're going to try to do everything we can to slow down your crazy agenda that is driving up the price of everything. We're going to speak out against and do everything we can to make sure the Department of Justice quits attacking parents. God bless the whistleblower who came forward and gave us the information, sent from the Counterterrorism Division of the FBI. We could be dealing with that issue today. We could be holding the Attorney General accountable, the Justice Department accountable for what they're doing. No. We're going to attack President Trump again. Democrats, that's the only thing they can do because they can't talk about anything else. I hope we defeat this bill. Yield back my time.
The gentleman from Ohio is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Democrats prevent Republicans from serving on the Select Committee. Democrats kick Republicans off standing committees. Democrats try to make D.C. a state. Democrats try to end the filibuster. They try to pack the court. They do secret impeachment hearings in the bunker in the basement of the Capitol. And they just said a naval veteran is afraid of the truth. And now today, they are destroying executive privilege. The United States Supreme Court held those who assist the president must be free to explore alternatives in the process of shaping policies and making decisions, and to do so in a way that many would be unwilling to do except privately. The court further stated presidential administrations of both parties have asserted that presidents' close advisors are an extension of the president. Who are these close advisors? Who are these individuals who are an extension of the President of the United States? Well, there's actually a bunch. But certainly the three most important are the National Security Advisor, the White House Counsel, and the Chief of Staff to the President. And I would argue the Chief of Staff is the closest of the close. He's the one who spends more time with the Commander-in-Chief than anyone else. Now, why do we have this privilege? Why do we have it? Why is the decision-making process between the president and his close advisors a private matter? Why is that? Well, guess what? The Supreme Court told us the answer to that one, too. Quote, executive privilege serves the necessity for protection of the public interest in candid, objective, and even harsh opinions in presidential decision-making. Let me just say that again. Executive privilege serves the public interest. It's for us. It's for we the people. It's not for President Trump. It's not for Mark Meadows. It's not for any president. It's not for any chief of staff. It's for the country. But the Democrats, they're not going to worry about that. They're going to forget about that because they think this is good politics. They think this is all about politics. They used to care. They used to care about executive privilege when Republicans wanted information. During the Fast and Furious scandal, President Obama asserted executive privilege for bureaucrats at ATF and DOJ. And think about it. A bureaucrat in a federal agency gets privilege but not the chief of staff to the president? Because Mark Meadows worked for President Trump, and Democrats have been out to get President Trump before he ever took office when they first tried to spy on him, actually did spy on him in 2016. They're going to destroy this precedent, even though this very question is in front of the courts as we speak. They're going to destroy this precedent that's been around since 1794, when our first president first asserted it. And for what? What did Mark Meadows do? He gave the committee thousands of emails. He gave the committee thousands of text messages, and he agreed to come in front of the committee and answer any question as long as it didn't violate executive privilege. The privilege that's not his to waive, it belongs to the president. The privilege that the court said is critical to executive decision-making, the privilege that exists for the benefit of we, the people, and the privilege that's been around since George Washington asserted it. But Democrats says, nope, not good enough, Mr. Meadows. You've got to come in and answer any and every question we ask you, or we're going to try to put you in prison. It's disgusting. It is so disgusting. Think about it. We weren't allowed to know who the anonymous, so-called anonymous whistleblower was when they tried to impeach President Trump, did impeach President Trump, but Democrats can destroy executive privilege? We weren't allowed to, the country wasn't allowed to know what took place in that bunker in the basement of the Capitol during impeachment, but they get to know any and everything they want about conversations between the president and his top advisor. This is so wrong. Democrats on the Select Committee, they also can't make up their minds. With Steve Bannon, they said, you have to appear in person to assert any privilege. And because he didn't come, they held him in contempt. With Jeff Clark, they said, come in person, assert privilege, which he did. And they said, nope, that's not good enough, and they held him in contempt. And now with Mark Meadows, he gave him thousands of documents and agreed to come. And they still said, not good enough. Not good enough. What a charade. Make no mistake. Make no mistake. When Democrats vote in favor of this resolution, it is a vote to put a good man in prison. That is what don't pretend to argue either. Don't even attempt the argument. No, no, no. This is just a House acting. The Justice Department will make a decision whether to prosecute or not. Come on. Is there anyone who believes that? It took the Attorney General all of 5 days to treat parents as terrorists. All of 5 days. If a left-wing political group can write the White House asking the Department of Justice to use the Patriot Act against moms and dads, and 5 days later the Attorney General of the United States does just that, then what do you think he's going to do when 225 Democrats in the House of Representatives ask him to put President Trump's chief of staff in prison? I've been in Congress a while, 15 years. I've seen Democrats weaponize the government to attack their political opponents. 10 years ago, they used the IRS to target good people around this country, good conservative people. 5 years ago, they used the FBI to spy on, abused the FISA process, used the FBI to spy on President Trump's campaign. 2 months ago, it was the Department of Justice using the Counterterrorism Division at the FBI to put a threat tag, a label, a designation on parents who had the gall to go speak up at a school board meetings and defend their kids, speak out against some crazy curriculum. And now they're destroying executive privilege. Now they're attacking that. And this might be the worst. Destroying a precedent that has been around since George Washington and treating Mark Meadows as a criminal. Mark Meadows is our former colleague. He is a good man, and he is my friend. And this is as wrong as it gets. And I think deep down, everyone knows it. I think they know it as well. They know this is wrong. We've all served with this guy. He is co-sponsored. He's done more work with Democrats than probably any Republican. We all know what a good man he is, and this is as wrong as it gets. You all know it. But your lust for power, your lust to get your opponents is so intense, you don't care. I hope you reconsider. I hope we don't take this action. Madam Speaker, I yield back.
The gentleman from Indiana reserves the balance of his time.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. McCary, How many, well, let me start with this. What's the budget at CDC? Do you happen to know that?
CDC, it's about $9 billion, sir.
How about at NIAID? What's the budget there?
$6 billion.
6 billion, 9 billion at CDC, 6 billion NIAID. What about NIH? What's the budget there?
Between 42 and 43 billion.
42 and 43. So I do the quick math. That's like 58 billion dollars. That's annual, right?
Annual.
Okay. And you know how many people work at CDC?
CDC and NIH together, about 30,000 people.
30,000. What about if you add in NIAID? Do you know how many that is? Or they're part of NIH as well, right? So 30. What was that number?
That's right. That's right. 31,000 people between CDC and NIH.
31,000 people spending $58 billion a year. Why hasn't our government done a study on natural immunity?
If I can be honest, Representative Jordan, I don't think they want to know the answer. It would undermine the indiscriminate vaccination policy for every single human being, including extremely low-risk people.
So, how many Americans have got COVID since we've had this virus? Do you know?
North of half of Americans, based on a Columbia University study that showed 1 in 3 had COVID at the end of last year, a year ago.
So there's certainly a sufficient sample size to do a study, and there's 57 to 58 billion dollars. I mean, you could use some of that money to do a study, and then of course, you know, you got 30-some thousand people who could conceivably do a study on a pretty fundamental question. Now, I think I saw in your opening statement that you're actually doing a study on natural immunity. Is that right?
That's right. With private funding, Johns Hopkins, my research team is doing a study.
Okay, so there's no grant money coming from CDC, NIH, nothing like that?
No, sir.
And are any of these 30-some thousand employees helping you with your study?
No, sir.
Now, other countries, if I understand, I think this was in your opening statement as well, other countries have done this study. Is that correct?
Most of our learnings come from Israel and other countries. Yes, sir.
And what have they found? Let's start with the Israel study, if you could just refresh my memory. What did Israel find?
The Israel study is the largest study done worldwide, and it found that natural immunity adjusted for age and comorbidity is 27 times more effective than vaccinated immunity. And they just put out on December 5th another study, follow-up study, again affirming similar results, that natural immunity is stronger than vaccinated immunity.
But the scientists in our government at CDC and NIH, they don't account for that. They don't talk about that. What do they say about that study?
They never talk about it unless asked. But I would say that they are doing worse than being absent on the topic. They are undermining natural immunity through 2 studies that the CDC did that are so flawed, that are so poorly put together. Honestly, they would not qualify for a 7th grade science fair. The results cannot be derived from the data. And it's a disgrace that those 2 studies were put out because it undermines the larger body of science.
So they won't talk about international studies that conclude that natural immunity is 27 times better than the vaccine, but they will do some bogus, in your words, some 7th grade science experiment studies using some of those 33,000 employees and using some of that $58 billion of the American taxpayer money. They will do that. Is that fair?
That's fair. I will say their intention is noble, but just very paternalistic. That is, they believe, and from private conversations, that if they acknowledge natural immunity, some people may avoid vaccination and think I'll just get the infection. We don't want people to do that, but we can be honest with the data and encourage vaccination at the same time.
I think the American people, particularly ones paying, this is their money, they expect honesty and transparency from our government. They don't expect to be deceived. So, I mean, this is what gets me. We can spend money. Some of that $58 billion and some of the resources at NIH and CDC can be used to fund gain of function research and give a grant to EcoHealth, who then sends some of that money to a lab in Wuhan, China. That's just fine, but we can't find any resources to deal with a fundamental question about natural immunity, and so much so that you have to go out and get private funding to do it yourself.
That's right. The NIH spent twice as much money on aging research last year, the year of COVID, more than they spent on COVID research.
This would be laughable if it wasn't so serious. And the implications when you think about these mandates and everything else that's happening, what it's doing to our economy, not to mention just being honest with the American people who, after all, it's their money. But yet we have the head guy, Mr. Fauci, Dr. Fauci, saying, I represent science, but he's afraid to actually do the science and do the studies that need to be done to answer this question. And we have to rely on international studies and your private study to get the truth to the American people.
We've subjected 72 million children to intense restrictions for 2 years, yet we don't have the most basic research. We've never had an NIH funded study on masks in kids, and we've never had any information revealed by the CDC on whether or not any healthy child has died
So,
of
doctor,
COVID.
it's either they know the answer and don't want the American people. They know the answer and don't want the American people to know, or they do know the answer and are trying to hide it. I mean, it's like they know the answer, or they're not sure the answer, I should say, or they know the answer and are trying to hide it from the American people. It's one of those two.